Well, I'd like to introduce myself to everyone. My name is Victoria Matias. I am the Community Coordinator for Texas Health and Environment Alliance, or THEA for short. We are so excited to be hosting this first session of 2026 of CHEJ's monthly training webinars. So a little run of how it's going to go today. We are going to do some introductions here in a minute, and then we'll move on to the presentation, which will last about 25 minutes. And after that, we'll do a Q&A session the remainder of the time. A few housekeeping items as people are still coming in. Please make sure to keep your microphones on mute to avoid background noise throughout the presentation. And if you do have questions as the presentation is ongoing, feel free to drop them in the chat. Myself and some other team members on the back end will be monitoring that, and we'll do our best to get to all of your questions during the Q&A session. You will be receiving the recording of this training along with a handout by the end of the week. And before I get to introducing our speakers, you will see a poll popping up on your screen. So we would like to get to know our audience better. We would really appreciate it if you could put on that poll, where are you joining us from? If you are in the United States, let us know which state you're from. And if you are international, what country are you joining from? All right, for those that just were let in the room just now, there will be a poll popping up here in a minute. If you could please let us know where you're joining us from. That's okay. All right, and we'll wait just 2 more minutes to let people finish hopping on. There's quite a few people still getting into the waiting room, getting into the call. All right. Well, for the last few that just joined us, please make sure to fill out that poll. We really want to get to know our audience. And I know I'm a new face, and we have a couple new faces on the call. So we'll get started with some introductions. First of all, well, for those of you that just joined us, my name is Victoria Matias. I'm the Community Coordinator for Texas Health and Environment Alliance. We will keep referring to it as THEA for short. And I want to introduce to you guys the founder and executive director of THEA, the new home for CHEJ. And so you know well, a little bit about THEA. THEA strives to protect public health and the environment by supporting impacted communities to advocate effectively for the cleanup of historical contamination. But I will let Jackie tell you a little bit more about THEA and about this transition of THEA joining and being the home for CHEJ. So I'll hand it off to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Victoria. As Victoria said, I'm the founder and executive director of Texas Health and Environment Alliance, and we are based out of Houston, Texas. I started THEA over a decade ago because my own community was home to several Superfund sites, and Most of us did not understand what living amongst Superfund sites meant for our health or what we could do about it. Nobody was translating the science. No one was helping families like mine, attempting to make informed decisions. And people who thought if something was wrong with our environment, somebody would call us, knock on our door, or send us a letter. Like CHEJ, THEA was truly founded out of necessity and from a belief that communities deserve clear data, honest answers, and a pathway to action. As many of you know, and Victoria commented on, CHEJ is now a national program of THEA. The transition that's taking place right now is about stewardship, preserving what has worked for decades while ensuring that CHEJ's programs continue to serve communities across the country. One of the most important parts of CHEJ's legacy has been access to science and building capacity. We're honored that CHEJ's longtime scientist has joined our team. He was actually trained by Stephen, who you all will hear from here in a few minutes, and he will continue providing technical assistance to communities nationwide, doing things like reviewing health studies, interpreting environmental sampling data, evaluating remediation plans, and helping residents understand what proposed cleanup actions actually mean. At THEA, we believe that data must be transparent and it must be accessible. More personally to me, communities should never have to navigate the complex scientific and regulatory processes alone. Like CHEJ's founder, Lois Gibbs, I came to this work through a lived experience. Lois began as a mother fighting for her family and challenging the entire system, and in fact, creating an entire system out of it to protect her community. I was a daughter with unexplained health problems who discovered contamination in our water well during a hydrology study in college. Lois and I both saw that if the bureaucratic process was going to work, we were going to have to help organize our communities, inform our neighbors, and actually make the process work. We both committed our lives to equipping people with the tools to protect themselves and to create change for their own communities. Now, our goal is simple: preserve CHEJ's time-tested model, strengthen it, and ensure that communities facing environmental harm, whether it's here in Texas or across the nation, have somewhere to turn. So we're grateful that you're here today. These learning spaces have always been about equipping people with information and confidence, and that very much continues.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I want to let everybody know that if you are curious and you want to learn more about THEA, about this transition, we will be having a call specifically for that on March 3rd at noon, where we will talk all about THEA plus CHEJ and this national program. So please join us March 3rd at noon. You will receive this reminder again in your emails and in the newsletters, so keep an eye out for that registration. All right, so let's get on to what everybody came here for today, which is our environmental testing webinar, this much awaited. And I want to introduce our speaker today. It is Stephen Lester, the former science director of CHEJ. And he's been providing scientific and technical assistance to communities concerned about environmental health issues. He directed CHEJ's research efforts, which produced over 100 guidebooks and fact packs. His primary work at the center involved translating technical jargon into everyday language and helping people understand the role of science and technical information in community struggles. Mr. Lester got his start working with communities when he was hired in 1978 by the New York State Department of Health to be the technical advisor to the residents of Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York. And since then has sat on numerous scientific advisory committees, including the National Research Council of the National Academies, formerly known as the National Academies of Science. Mr. Lester has a master's degree in toxicology from the Harvard University School of Public Health and a master's degree in environmental health from the New York University Institute of Environmental Medicine. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Stephen, and let's learn a little bit about environmental testing.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. And thank you, Jackie. It's really an honor for me to be here, um, to be the first speaker in this series for THEA/CHEJ. Some of you may have been to earlier sessions of environmental testing that I've done for CHEJ, and it's really a pleasure for me to be back here again in a slightly different context, which I'm very excited about. I hope you can come to that March 3rd session where we talk more about the transition from CHEJ and to THEA and vice versa. And I'm very excited that THEA has stepped into this space that we have been operating on for over 40 years, close to 45, and I'm very excited about that. But let me tell you more now about sort of environmental testing, something that's very dear to my heart and very dear to the time I've spent in this business, so to speak. What is environmental testing? In a very simple way, it's just gathering data that can tell information about contamination. I mean, that's fundamentally what it is. And it's important because it provides so much information about what's going on in your community. So many people contact us, and what we've realized that until they can get a handle on the testing information and the science and technical side of things, many groups can't even begin to think about how to organize or the value and importance of organizing. So it provides evidence of contamination, provides evidence of how far the contamination may have traveled, provides information on the chemicals that people have been exposed to. And so it's a critical piece, and it's also the basis of evaluating health risks. So it's the information that you need to understand all this. But but it's critical to understand that the testing is while valuable by itself is not that helpful. And I mean that in the context of, and many groups over the years have said things like, well, if we just got the right information in the hands of the right people, they'll do the right thing, right? Right? Wouldn't they do the right thing if we just had the right information? And that's a lesson many groups learn pretty quickly, that it doesn't work that way. It's not the information that matters, it's what you do with it. It's the plan you develop as a community organization to take that information and educate others, use it as a basis for your arguments and the foundation for what you're trying to achieve in your community, and eventually as a strategy, as part of your strategy for how you win. So testing's critical, but it's just a piece of information you use in your strategies. So the key is recognizing that. And as a scientist, it's one of the very first things I learned going back to my days at Love Canal, when Lois had, like everybody else, I'm probably Jackie too, when she first got started, she was convinced that she went door to door and gathered health data after the first evacuation of Love Canal to gather the information about health problems in the community outside the evacuated area. And she was convinced that, and when she gathered all the data, it was clear that people were sick, people had problems, people were had been exposed to the chemicals. So myself and another scientist took that data to state of New York, and what did they tell us? They told us that it was useless housewife data. And so we were shocked, we were stunned. It's a lot of background I'm not going into there because we don't have time for that story, but it's typically what happens with state agencies and federal agencies as well. That the information that you gather, you as a community person gather, isn't going to work. And so in Lois' case, she then developed a strategy that used that data not to convince the state, but to convince people all over the Western New York that the state has fallen on their faces. And so she used it as part of a plan. And that turned out to be a very effective plan because she ended up winning her fight. So knowing what to do with it is really critical. So where do you begin when you're thinking about environmental testing? And I think one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is why do you want to do environmental testing? What's your goal in gathering this information? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you using it just to convince yourself that there's contamination in your drinking water or maybe in the soil around your home or nearby? Are you using it together to try to convince the government or the politicians that there's a problem? Are you using it to further a lawsuit or maybe to be a part of a lawsuit? But asking that questions among your community and yourselves is really important because it determines a lot of where you test and why you're and what you're looking for and so on. So that's real important. Why do you want to gather this information? One thing we often suggest people do is to make a map of your community. Again, depending on your goals, but making a map is always a valuable step. At least it's been our experience. And what you would do is try to kind of figure out where people live, starting with yourself if you're in this neighborhood, and look at the potential pollution sources. I mean, why are you thinking about doing testing? It's because it smells, it's in the air, your water tastes funny, it's there's some other obvious source of contamination that's making you think we need to do some testing. And so those are all questions you're going to be asking yourselves as you think about this, as you try to answer the bigger question um, of why do you want to do this? And sometimes you can go buy a map of your community. You can buy one, or there may be one already existing. But most of our community folks don't have that because they're really talking about neighborhoods in that community. So you kind of might want to make your own. And going through this process, and I went through this with a group in New York not too long ago, where they said to me, it was after one of these calls actually, they called and they said, how do we, like we want to do our own testing. We're willing to pay for it. Where do we get? How do we begin? Where do we go? And so I said, the first thing you should do is walk your community. Figure out, because you, as the people who live there, know your community better than I or anybody from outside the community. You know where people live, you know where the potential sources are, you know where the potential emissions are, and just put all these little pieces on there. And it turned into a very helpful exercise for that group. And we went back and forth a number of times, and it started with them walking their neighborhood and thinking about testing and what do they want to test and where do they want to test? Because these are all the right questions. Where do you test? What do you look for? And so another question then becomes very quickly is like, who should do the testing? Is it something that you can pay for yourself? Is it something that you want the government to do? Is it something you want to hire someone to do? And there are pros and cons to each of these steps. And so I'm going to use this moment to tell you that we do have a document. It's on our website, and it's, if I can put this up here, it's called Environmental Testing. Very simple. And it goes through testing in ways that you probably never imagined. Not that it has all the it's not a complicated technical report. It's a simple report that talks about soil, air, groundwater, surface water, what to test for, how to test, and a big piece of the testing question is interpreting what you have. And it talks a little about that too as well. And I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of who should do the testing. It's clear that one of the main things that you get if you do this yourself is to keep control of the information that you're gathering. It obviously it's more costly if you do it yourself, but you maintain control not only of the information as after the testing is complete and the analysis is done, but you can determine where to test and what to look for, and at what concentrations, what detection limits you want to look for. All of these things can influence the outcome of your results. And one of the most important things I've learned about so much of this is that if the testing isn't done properly, if it's not looking for the right things, if it's not sampled in the right location, then you don't have a very good result. And so often I see government agencies not doing the right testing, sampling in the wrong place, looking for the wrong things, and then telling people we spent thousands of dollars to gather hundreds of samples. This is what we got. And we can't find any levels of contamination above a certain concentration that would be of concern. And yet when you sit back and look at those test reports and ask the questions of what was the goal of this sampling? Sometimes it's not even in the report. That's another important question for you to be asking if somebody else is doing a report. and gone out and done testing. What is the goal here? Because the goal determines, it's just like when you ask yourself the goals of why do you want to do testing, when the government comes in to do the testing and they ask that question, they're likely to have a very different answer than if you are being asked that question. They don't come and ask for your opinion to say, well, what do you think the best way to do this is? Should we test here? Should we test there? They're not going to talk to you. They don't want anything to do with most community people. So because they're the quote experts, they know what to do. And so what they will do is do some kind of grid or some kind of supposedly objective process of identifying where to sample and what to look for. But when you do that, you often miss the hotspots. You often end up looking for the wrong things. You're not asking the right questions, and you don't have very useful data. Garbage in yields garbage out. And and then of course that's used by the government as the basis for their making their decisions. A lousy report made by a consultant who either didn't know what he was doing or didn't care, and knew who was paying them to do this work and what mattered to them. And sometimes that's overt, and sometimes it's not. So whatever testing is being done, you want to find out why that testing is being done and what the goals are. So the next question I want to raise and talk about a little bit, and then you'll have plenty of time to ask questions, and we can go into as much depth as we may want to in a limited call. But what medium do you sample? Is it air? Is it water? Is it soil? Surface water? And they're not all the same. Probably the most important, not important, that's not the right word, probably the most information packed, if you will, tells you the most is soil data. The least, on the other end of that spectrum, the least valuable is air data. And air data is not so important and valuable because it's like taking a picture of the air at a moment in time. It can change in a heartbeat. It can change very quickly and does. So whatever testing you've done, it's not very valuable. Even if you take it for like a 24-hour period, which is often the best way to do something like that. It's very hard to, because when you do something like that, then you lose the ups and the downs. You lose the pulses, if you will, of pollution that come and go. And soil's the most stable. It's the most reliable. When you have a soil result, you can really gives you good information about what's there and at what concentration. So that's good. Water testing is good too. I don't find it quite as helpful as soil data, but it's very helpful. The advantage of water testing is that there are some standards for legally enforceable standards, so-called drinking water standards. So if it's a drinking water source that you're testing, then there are some standards if you go and test that to sort of measure what you're finding against what's there. Of course, the chemicals for which there are standards is limited. It's only, well, they've expanded it in recent years, but it's still limited. So there's not like, depending on what the source of your contamination is. If it's an industrial plant, it might have some pretty unusual chemicals that releasing into the air that are not likely to be, or in the drinking water, and they're not likely to be standards for them. So once you decide where you're going to take your sample, then what are you going to look for? And of course, that's driven a lot by what you think the source is. And you need to think about that, because testing is expensive. If you're doing it yourself or you're trying to get this government to do it, whoever's doing the testing, it's expensive. And you can't look for everything. Although there are some lab procedures, my favorite is something called the priority pollutant list. And it's a list of 128 chemicals. This is a water test. It can be done in either groundwater or drinking water. And it's a list of 128 chemicals. It used to be 129, but The 129th is dioxin, and that got taken off the list because it became so expensive to analyze for dioxins that it was as much to test for for dioxin alone as to test for the other 128. And so they dropped that from the list, and that was a requirement in some Clean Water Action amendment down in recent times, that the party pollutant list had to be tested. And that's a good list. That includes metals, it includes volatile organics, it includes semi-volatile organics, it includes PCBs, it includes a handful of pesticides, and I'm sure I'm missing one or two other categories and groups, but it's the most exhaustive listing of pollutants that you can look for. There is no such model for, although you could test for party pollutants in air, for at least those that are volatile. And there are many of those, so that's an option also, but not as effective because it's not intended for air testing. And you can test for the party pollutant lists in soil. It can be done there as well, and that can give you good information. So there are also what are referred to as general pollution parameters. When I first got in this business, and it was a long time ago, most of the state agencies, when they did their testing, would look for what are called traditional pollution parameters or general pollution parameters, because that was the standard at that time back in the 80s and 90s. It was, and it's still being used today in some places, unfortunately, but it was a standard water pollution test. But the problem with it is that it doesn't look for toxic chemicals, which is what everybody cares about. So if you ever see a traditional general pollution parameters analysis being done, and that identifies things like total organic carbon, suspended solids, chlorides, what else? A few other things that are just not really of concern from a toxic point of view. But a lot of state agencies do it because that's what they know how to do, and that's what's typical and common. So not very helpful though. There's also the possibility of using or testing for what are considered screening compounds. And these are kind of categories or groups of compounds so if you're not sure what to look for, then you can do a total halogen or a total organic halogen test, or TOX. And so that will tell you all of the halogenated hydrocarbons that are present in the sample you've tested. That can be helpful as a screen to identify whether there are any of those kind of compounds present. The biggest limitation of using something like that is that you need a lot of contaminants for it to show up, because it has very high detection limits. And I do want to talk about detection limits for a minute, because I think that's a critical part of any kind of analysis of testing results. So there are also another screening compound is something called TOC, total organic carbon. Again, doesn't really deal with, it's not very useful for most analytical work. Another one that you may have heard of is something called BTEX. And that's usually done for screening for gasoline contaminants. The BTEX stands for benzene, toluene, ethylene, and xylene, for common contaminants in gasoline. So it's a standardized test that labs have developed. And labs have developed standardized tests for many of these for all of the screens, certainly, and for some of the like party pollutant tests, because it's a legal requirement for some type of work, and for drinking water standards and a few other things. So they have some standardized testing. And the last one I want to mention is VOCs, volatile organic compounds. So anything that's volatile can be analyzed as a group and looked at. But I want to give you a simple little example of how some of these kinds of screening compounds aren't so helpful or useful. Let me just check the time here. Okay. And that is, some of you may have heard about the horrific train wreck in East Palestine, Ohio, that occurred a couple of years ago. And there was a train that derailed. 10 tanker cars were derailed, and 4 or 5 of them were vinyl chloride. And the EPA came in, and actually the company that owned the train, Southern Pacific, not Southern Pacific, Norfolk Southern. whatever it is. I'm blanking on it. But anyway, the company that owned the train decided that they were going to burn the vinyl chloride that were in those tanker cars. And they created an enormous black cloud that released, among other chemicals, dioxin and vinyl chloride into the air. People were breathing it. And so when EPA came in to do testing, they did total VOC tests because they said they didn't know what to look for. And I'm scratching my head when I hear this. I mean, why wouldn't you start with vinyl chloride? It's a volatile compound. It was what they burned. It was probably the most important thing for your testing, but they didn't do that. They did VOCs. And of course, they found VOCs present, but they weren't at enormously high levels. So they said everything's fine. So these screening compounds have their limitations, and that's a simple example of one. And it's really can be a problem. So how do you interpret the results from these tests? I mentioned detection limits. Detection limits are probably asking about detection limits are probably the most important question you can ask. And by the way, you will get with your recording of this call a list of questions to ask. I've put together a list of questions for groundwater, soil, air, and I'm missing surface water, I guess. And there's general questions. And a lot of the questions have to do about the data collection process. I mentioned garbage in, garbage out. If you are looking for the wrong things and you don't take samples from in the right place, you're not going to get good or useful data. Another way that data is also limited is by the detection limit that the lab uses to determine what's present in the sample that was collected. It's a little bit like the volume on your radio. If it's the setting of the detection limit determines whether you hear the music or you don't, whether you see the contaminant or you don't. And it's really a black and white kind of thing, although they can tell you that, oh, it's below that limit, that detection limit, but we don't know how much, or we're not sure how much it is because it's not reliable. But where you put that detection limit tells you is critical to getting testing done or being able to identify the presence of chemicals at very low concentrations. And we're always talking about parts per billion as a minimum, and sometimes parts per trillion. In the case of a chemical like dioxin, you're always looking for parts per trillion. So at that level, small differences make big effects. And so you always want to know what the detection limit is, because that's a critical way of understanding whether you have data that's useful or not. Because I can't tell you how many times I've seen detection limits set, including in East Palestine, Ohio, which would had more cameras on it and more media attention, but still the EPA just did very high detection limits in a lot of this work, and then claimed again, as I mentioned earlier, that there were hundreds of samples taken and all this data was collected, and it doesn't show any cause for concern. And it's not because it wasn't there. It's just because the data that was collected was inappropriately done, and the detection limits were too high. So the other thing about the data here is how do you interpret it? I mentioned that there were drinking water standards. For air and soil, there really are no federal guidelines. I mean, there are guidelines, but there are no standards. There is something called risk-based screening levels that exist for both soil, that's the primary use for them, and there's also some values for certain limited air exposures. So those are good guidelines. And they're good for sort of a measuring stick for saying, well, is this a problem or not? But EPA won't make any decisions based on the results of any of these screening levels or using them as for comparisons. But it's always helpful to have something to compare your results to. And there's not a lot of standards out there. I mentioned only drinking water. I've touched on some of the uncertainties in the sampling procedures, particularly but there is particularly the detection limits question, but there's so many more. And I think getting at the questions that you'll get afterwards will help identify some of those uncertainties. You know, a lot of it has to do with common sense. That's why we suggest people go out and walk their site and make a map and start to think about this thing with just their intuitive gut feelings about what to test for and where to test, because those are often more likely to give you good information for the concerns you have than what the state might do, who doesn't have the same concerns you have. don't ever think they share your same goals. Some individuals might, but not the agencies themselves. So I mentioned the handout. I'm going to wrap up here. I mentioned the handout, the questions to ask that will be available. It deals with, I mentioned all the different parts. And two last thoughts I want to leave you with. One is the notion of garbage in and garbage out. Data is only as good as the procedures used to collect it and the plan for where to test and what to look for. And if you're not part of those conversations, you need to ask those questions to understand how the state or the federal government did the testing they did, so that you can better understand whether the value of it is and how helpful it is. And lastly, kind of where I started, I want to mention that this data is not by itself likely to ever convince your state agency that something needs to be done in your community. It's critical to have it, but you have to figure out how to use it in a way that will create what you want and create the pressure that you need to put on government to move or make decisions. I've been doing this for a long time, and government isn't going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. They're only going to do the right thing if you create enough pressure on them that you force them to do it. And testing data is one way you can create the pressure. So that's it for my presentation. Happy to answer questions and talk more about anything that we've talked about today or mentioned.
Thank you, Stephen. You know, a few things came to mind, and one in particular was our experience with the dioxin testing around the San Jacinto River Waste Pit Superfund site, which is the site I grew up recreating on top of and around. And a lot of residents got a false sense of security when the EPA did the dioxin sediment and soil testing. And so based on location, as you mentioned multiple times, creating your map where, figuring out where you want to test, what happened was the EPA was combining the samples and running a portion of that combined sample in the lab, or composite sampling. And so they were collecting samples from properties where the river had flooded, the river, which is contaminated with dioxin, had flooded the property, and then areas that had never flooded, and combining it and running it as one. And so we saw, varying results even with that type of sampling, but it really gave us a false sense of security to some residents. And I wanted to bring that up because it's such an important point to your notion of deciding where to test.
Yes, that's a really great example of kind of the Wild West kind of approach to testing that really does exist. Um, Jackie's referring to, there's two kinds of soil samples you could take. One is a grab sample, which is you go to a location and you grab a chunk of the soil. You have a little aliquot, a little scooper, and you take it and you have it, and you know exactly what's in that location. The other approach is to do a composite sample. Usually means you identify that same starting point, but then you'll go around it like 5 feet. The radius, how far away you go varies, but it usually 4 or 5 components, samples are collected around that sample point, and they're combined together, and you get a composite sample. And composite sample is one of the best strategies that government uses to dilute any particular sampling. And they have reasons for it. They have arguments why that's a better way to do it, but it's never a better way if you're concerned about public health, because you're always losing the hotspots, and whatever you get is diluted. If you find anything, it's never what it could be and what it is in terms of risk, health risk, community risk. So it's a great example.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to pass it over to Victoria now. She's been monitoring the chat, and we've got some really great questions there.
Yes, thank you. So one of our first questions in the chat was, are there government testing kits that are provided for members of the public to do testing that they trust? In Florida, the county offered low-cost testing, and they provided the collection containers and provided test results. The cheapest kit I can find is $400 on Amazon.
I've never been a fan of those kits. There are different kind of kits out there. Usually they're private companies that create them. And the problem I find with them is that it's a one stop shopping kind of thing, in the sense that, it's designed to get a few general parameters analyzed. It's not specific to a community. Sometimes if you can find a lab that will work with you, and over the years I have found labs that will work with communities that will do analysis based on what you need and what you want and where you want to take it and what you want to look for. And that's a little more complicated because it means that they're dealing with you the way they deal with any corporate customer, which is where most of their money comes from, in the sense that they're going to give you what you want. But short term, but testing done in those kits is usually not very helpful, and obviously through your own example, pretty expensive.
A related question, thank you, Stephen. A related question that came in says, when you recommend doing your own testing, do you mean using a commercial lab versus government lab?
No, not necessarily. That's not the distinction I was making, commercial versus government. The distinction was more that you're controlling it, whether you're gathering the data yourself, which is a possibility that can be done and is done, or you're hiring a lab to do it for you. Either they send, and their lab, if you hire a lab that you identify, it's usually a private lab. In this case, it wouldn't be a government lab. They would often give you the sample bottles, they would give you the instructions, they would give you the instructions for collecting the sample, instructions for mailing it, storing it, packaging it, and returning it to them. So usually that's all done by the lab, provided by the lab, and part of the cost of what you pay for the analysis. And so that's really more about, if you're doing it yourself, it's usually that way. Either you collect the sample yourself, but you're going to need a lab to work with to do the analysis. And often they give you everything you need to do it, including sometimes can be very helpful. And many of them are. The problem was you never know, because the most labs will, get most of their money from companies and the government. And so if you're in a politically hot place, or if you're involved in a community where there's controversy, most labs won't want to be involved because they don't want to be tagged as working with the community. So it's often best to try to find a lab outside of your state so that kind of problem doesn't really surface. So if you can find, that's what I've found it works best, is identify a lab out of state, even though they may be less familiar with your local area, they don't have usually political concerns, and often will do the testing.
That's really good insight, Stephen. Thank you for that. A couple more questions from the chat. Why would they stop testing for dioxin when that's the main problem in the area?
Is this in the example of the East Palestine or some other in general?
So I believe this question was dropped in the chat back when you were talking about the 129 list that became 128.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, yeah. There were two reasons for that. One is, I mentioned, it's expensive. So no, they don't want to require all these state agencies or companies to have to test for dioxin because it's simply expensive. So if they do 10 tests and it's going to spend them $1,200 or $1,500 for each dioxin alone, it's just too expensive. They don't want to create that hardship, if you will, for the companies. And the other is dioxin's a powder keg. If people find that dioxin is present, and then that changes the dynamic of the public health concerns of any result. So they realize that they don't want to ask that question. They don't want to require that testing because it's a bit of a Pandora's box. So it was political and economical.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And another question from this same participant. So if the commercial kits are no good, how can we get good testing for homeowners? Is there a way to get the government to tell me if there is dioxin in my soil in the riverfront? My riverfront, sorry, I misread that.
That goes back to the power of your group. The government won't do it because you ask them. And if you're an individual, they will never do it because it's expensive to test for any person. And the government doesn't see themselves as being the company, an individual's consultant kind of thing. So you have to have a group, and the group has to have a little power, if you will. You have to have some muscle to create some pressure, on the community, on the state, on the government to do that kind of testing. But I have found that most of the time the government will do it. If the communities, if it's a political or a hot fight in a community and governments, the government's the right one to do the testing initially. But you have to ask some of these questions about how they're testing and where they're testing and what their goals are, because they can quickly gather data that's useless and create and spend a lot of money and take a lot of time and end up with data that's useless. And so, and you're kind of back where you started from. And it's one of the dangers of having the government do the testing for you is you kind of put the community organizing on hold. This is what people typically do. Oh, we're waiting for the test results. Well, doesn't mean you can't continue your organizing pressure, because the answers are never going to lie in that testing result. So you got to keep putting pressure on them. And if you get some good data, if you happen to get some good data, then it can really be useful to create more pressure. One of the best examples that I've seen with communities doing their own testing or going somewhere else other than government for testing, and there's a good bunch of the places where communities have done this themselves. They have to raise the money, which is never easy. But some communities that find it easier than others to raise a couple $1,000s or $5,000. You need that kind of money to even begin to do testing. Is to get a private lab and find one that's friendly. And I know a few that are that way, and there's a couple that will. I've found that most private labs, and there are a few big ones and a lot of smaller ones, that they're very open to working with community people. You'd be surprised. I would think I was surprised when I first found out about it. But they're willing to, help you, because a lot of times these people who work for these labs, they care about people and they care about testing and they care about helping people do testing. So they want to help. And so it's not a bad thing to try to identify a lab that will do some testing but you have to have the money to do that. That's the hard part. That's not easy. That's why often we suggest people just create the pressure on the government, but have some input on what the government is doing, because the government can quickly, and never wait for the results. As I mentioned, you gotta keep moving on your organizing as well.
Wonderful. And another question that came through says, any insights about radioactivity testing radon 226 from fracking waste in air and water?
I really can't say very much about that. I mean, one of the things that CHJ decided way back when was that we weren't going to take on two questions. One is pesticides and the other is radiation, because there are so many groups out there that do that our focus was just on toxics and chemicals. So I really don't have much to say about that. I have a little, sorry, but I have to pass. Can't be helpful there.
No worries. Another question. Have you conducted hair sample testing? Thoughts on its usefulness?
Yeah, we haven't done it. I've seen it though. I've had communities send us data, hair testing results to help with interpretation of the result, what they found. It can be useful because the value of it is that it collects samples over a long period of time. And for the substances, the metals in particular that tend to accumulate there, it can be helpful. So it's another piece of the puzzle, I would say. It's another way people can be exposed and way you can test what people have been exposed to. But how useful it is goes back to that question, that key question of like, why do you want to do this testing? Are you just going to educate yourself? That's a value. That's important. Educating yourself is a value, but are you looking to really take some action that will change something that's happening in your community? As an individual, you can't have much input or impact on changing what happens in your community, but as a group, you can. As an organization, you can. I mean, one of the things that CHJ has always been very proud of is that we help community people work the democratic system. Democracy is a wonderful thing when it works right. And you can do that by getting involved and having influence over the chemical impacts in your community. So it works. It works when you get people together.
And Stephen, I'll add to that regarding hair testing. That's one of the things that I did once I found heavy metals in my family's groundwater. I tested my body for heavy metals from my hair, my urine, and my nails. And I was tested for 21 heavy metals, and I had 19 of them in me. I was having extreme health problems, including seizures, and doctors for years could not figure out why I was having seizures like I was. And it was all because of the metals in my body. And so it helped, in our organizing and as a tool for the community, but it was pivotal for me getting back on my feet and my health. And I haven't had a seizure in, I think, 14 years now, once I went through heavy metal treatment. So it can really be pivotal. Another thing with testing of that sort is chickens' eggs. We tested our chickens' eggs, thinking, well, they live on this land, they were born on this land, they drink the same water as we do, and eat from the land. And so, and chickens excrete their toxins in their eggs. And so we found 21 out of 21 heavy metals in the chicken's eggs. Those tests were a little bit more expensive, though, on the eggs. But the hair was somewhat reasonable in the grand scheme of testing costs.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
I know
Great.
we've got a lot of really great questions, but I felt that might be helpful for people too.
Yep, yep. Great. Thank you.
No, wonderful.
Yeah.
Stephen, can you talk about what qualifies a lab certification, etc.?
Well, there are different certifications that each lab can hold. And probably the most important one is the ones that EPA has certain certifications that they provide. And the way that typically works is that the EPA will require a certain procedure to analyze for a group of compounds like volatile organic compounds or metals. And so a lab, and they have procedures that you have to follow, and the lab will follow those, and then EPA will evaluate in however ways they do that. And I'm not sure exactly how that is, but it's a little more than getting a license, but I'm not sure how much more. But the lab will follow those procedures precisely as EPA requires, and then EPA will certify them as being able to do that analysis. Like dioxin is a particular one. There's only 3 or 4 labs in the country that can analyze for dioxin according to the proper procedures. A bunch of labs can do it, but not everybody's certified to do analysis. And if you're going to go, if you're going to push the government on any results or go to law, to go to a court with any results, it has to be certified analysis. But even with a certified analysis, the data can be crap if they did do the right procedures in collecting the samples. Sample collection is the most important element of data analysis. If you don't know how the damn sample was analyzed, I get groups that send me data all the time and they say, can you review these results? And I could in isolation, but I will never do that because I have to understand how the data was collected. I mean, a lot of times groups don't know that, and we go back and forth a few times, and we try to gather as much information as possible about how the data was collected, because I mean, especially if there's not much there. If there's not much there, is it really because there's not much there, or because the data collection procedures were inaccurate or inappropriate? So yeah, it really varies, but lab certification is important, and you want to always look for that in the lab because as a minimum, it's a standard by which they operate by, and it's a way to make sure that the data collected or analyzed by one lab would be comparable to a data collected and analyzed by another lab.
Thank you, Stephen. I just monitoring the chat. We have a lot of great questions coming in and not a whole lot of time left. So I'm just gonna try to get to these last few as quickly as possible. There's one that says, any recommendations on different types of air, soil, and water testing for hydrogen sulfide and other pollutants caused by a landfill on top of a mine shaft?
Wow. I'm not sure I understand the question in the sense that Hydrogen sulfide is not on any of these lists that I was referring to. It's kind of its own compound. And it so you'd just be analyzing for that chemical if that's what you want to know, if that's the chemical of concern. So it's just whether it's in soil, air, water, it doesn't matter. You just want to analyze specifically for that compound. And again, you want to find out, you have to be concerned about detection limits. At what concentration do you look for? Where do you put that detection value? The other thing about detection limits and values is that the lower you make that detection limit, the more expensive it is to analyze that sample. And so there's a default, if you will, to have a higher detection limit because it's less expensive. But of course, the problem with that is you may have things present at concentrations that matter and that are important in terms of public health risk, especially that aren't going to be analyzed or detected. And the result and the interpretation of the result as well, there's nothing there. And in fact, it could be there, but the detection limits were too high and you couldn't find it, couldn't see it.
Thank you. Okay, so I have one that has a bit of context here. It says we are dealing with high nitrates in drinking water here in Florida. What we have been told is that 0.35 ppm is acceptable. Is this true? We have some areas that are in multiples higher than this. Local dairies are implicated as agriculture is the biggest source. Many are on unconfined geological areas.
That's an interesting question. I think that it is below the drinking water standard or the standard. It's not, I think it's referred to as a secondary standard. I believe that number is below that. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you for sure. I could look it up easily. But I think the bigger question here is anytime you have a number like that and the government tells you it's okay, the other question is, well, is that the only thing you're being exposed to? And because the bigger concern is cumulative in two directions, cumulative over time and cumulative in terms of additional exposures. And so somebody who may have been exposed to nitrates for years may have a value that's below, quote, a one-time exposure standard, but yet they may have become sensitized to it and now have showing responses to that concentration that our guidelines tell us are safe or non, nobody should respond to that. So it's hard to, in isolation, interpret that, but I'd be happy to talk with this person after the call or offline at a separate time, just to sort of work through that a little bit more. I mean, I do want to say, I know we're running out of time. We only have a couple of minutes left. That I do want to be clear that, and Jackie mentioned this, that THEA has hired a science person. His name is Mahir Vora. He's somebody that I've worked with for a good number of years, and I've been mentoring him, and he's been a part of CHEJ's work for 6 or 7 years now. And so he's available to help with these questions on a one-on-one basis. He's available to help interpret test results that you may have collected and you need some help and guidance with. And he's available to help you think through what to do with all of this stuff. Although that particular piece of this work is really best left to the organizers. But that capacity remains within CHEJ. I am stepping away, but Mahir is stepping in and is available. And so please do send your questions in to THEA, to CHEJ, whatever avenues you typically have been using, use those to send your questions and data, and we will get back to you.
Thank you, Stephen. And I want to highlight that again, stress the last point Stephen made. We do continue to provide one-on-one support to anyone that needs it out there. Jackie just dropped in the chat the most direct line to reach us, which is info@txhea.org. That is our email, and our phone number is also there. You're still welcome to use the regular channels. The website is still being monitored, but if you want to reach us the quickest, this is the quickest way to reach us is at info@txhea.org. And we are right at time. So I want to thank everybody that joined us today. We also want to let you know that our next training will be on March 17th, and the topic will be digital media outreach with Brenda Franco. We are really excited for this one. And again, remind you that on March 3rd at noon, we will host an introduction call of THEA plus CHEJ. So thank you so much again. Thank you, Stephen, for this wonderful presentation. And we hope that you all have a blessed rest of your day.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Thea.
Thank you,
Thank you
Stephen.
all for
Bye,
being here.
everyone.
Bye-bye.